This is the Storyworks Roundtable, where we have conversations about craft, because becoming a successful author begins with writing a great story.
Hey, Storyworks writers, if you're enjoying the podcast, we would love it if you could head over to wherever you get your podcasts and leave us an awesome review.
This week, author Talia Carner joins us at the round table to discuss her latest novel, The Third Daughter, just released this month by Harper Collins. We had a great time with Talia at the round table, and I just want to give you a little bit of context for this story, because in the first part, Talia and I dive right into it. So to make sure everybody's grounded in what's happening, the turn of the 20th century finds 14-year-old Batya in the Russian countryside, fleeing endless pogroms with her family. Desperate, her father leaps at the opportunity to marry Batya to a worldly, wealthy stranger who can guarantee his daughter an easy life and passage to America. But soon she discovers that she's entered a waking nightmare. Her new husband, that's in quotes, does indeed bring her to America, Buenos Aires, a vibrant, growing city in which prostitution is not only legal but deeply embedded in the culture. And now Batya is one of thousands of women tricked and sold into the oldest profession in the world. Now I'll just add to that Moskowitz is the character who takes her away from her family and later becomes her pimp. And Zui Migdal is a term you will hear throughout our conversation with Talia, and that is the name of the Jewish Union of Pimps in Buenos Aires. So they're the bad guys. We loved having Talia Carner join us at the round table, and I hope you enjoy these episodes. Hello and welcome to this week's Storyworks Roundtable. Today, I am excited to be joined by a very special guest, Talia Carner. At the heart of Talia Carner lies an activist, a feminist, and a humanitarian who gives a voice to those without one. A proud seventh-generation Sabra, the New York-based author is a woman unafraid to tackle controversial issues. Her psychological suspense novels bring to the forefront indignities and atrocities long ignored, and include Puppet Child, China Doll, Jerusalem Maiden, Hotel Moscow, and just this month, September 2019, the Harper Collins release of The Third Daughter. Formerly the publisher of Savvy Woman magazine and a consultant to Fortune 500 companies, Talia Carner is a committed supporter of global human rights. She is a board member of HBI, the Jewish Women Research Center at Brandeis University. Her addictions include chocolate, hats, ballet, and social justice. Welcome, Talia. Thank you so much for joining me.
Thank you so much for having me on your show.
You are welcome. So we are getting in depth into this, your fifth novel, Third Daughter, just released by Harper Collins. And before we talk about the book, tell us a little bit about your journey as an author.
Some people that I've met over the years told me that they had been maybe journalists for 20 years and were hoping one day to write a novel. Others had dreamed of writing, of getting that stardust of author idea, kind of just doused them. As they walk down the street, people will say, "Here comes this famous author." I never thought about writing. I did not plan on it. I had no interest beyond the fact that I was a good writer for business.
Mm-hmm.
I was in the business world for many years, and I wrote business plans, marketing plans, industry overviews, excellent sales letters, But that was it. I used writing for the purpose of business. On the side, I was also a very good storyteller, confining my storytelling abilities to my family. And I created characters for my children's bedtime stories. And over many years, I told probably hundreds of stories that I made at bedtime, never thinking of recording myself. Mm-hmm. But they were very specific characters that repeated themselves, whether the 3 kittens or the mischievous monkey and so on. And one day, on actually very specifically November 3rd, 1993 at 2:48 p.m., I sat down and began to type the book that did not get published, but eventually, over 20 years later, became Hotel Moscow. That was the reason for that particular time and date was that I had been to Russia 2 times, in 1993, teaching women entrepreneurial skills shortly after the fall of communism. And I unfortunately got stuck in the uprising of the Russian parliament against Boris Yeltsin in October 2nd or 3rd, 1993. And I ended up being on the run from the militia, and it was a very harrowing event. And this is pre-internet, so by the time I got back, of course, my poor husband called the whole world. Our congressman already put the State Department on alert. And people were calling me and saying, what happened? And since this was, as I'm saying, pre-internet, I started mailing out a hard copy of my report to the U.S. Information Agency that had sent me. It was a 23-page report. And on November 3rd, I had lunch with a friend who was a female who was a journalist. And I said to her, don't ask questions. Here's my report. All it needs is hot sex, and I have a novel. So she said, why don't you write it? So I said, okay. I went back to the office, and this is why I know when I started to type. And that's the beginning of my writing career. At that point, I had not been aware of the fact that writing a novel was a big challenge for many people. Mm-hmm. I did not know to be scared. That's what being stupid is for. But after I had this hefty draft of 640 pages, I started going to writers' conferences and signed up to workshops and started working with book groups, writing groups, and began to learn the craft of writing using that maiden effort to edit and learn the craft. Mm-hmm. That book never got published. I published other books, and then 20 years later, as I mentioned, I used the material for another book called Hotel Moscow. What I found out eventually was that the novel form, for me, is a natural form. Mm-hmm. That's the easy form. I think in kind of layered, multi-layered topics. I can see the geography and the psychological forces combined with the economic forces and the politics and the religion. And all of this as the kind of whole are working together in particular events that now go vertically, but they are constantly at play as the story moves on. And that kind of format is natural for me. Mm-hmm. Writing a poem, I'm not very good.
Right.
I need 100,000 words to express an idea.
Yes, I understand that. I am definitely the same way. I need long-form narrative. That is a pretty amazing story of how you got started in writing. And I love that you found the form of the novel suits the stories you want to tell. What specifically inspired third daughter?
The inspiration for third daughter probably came from more than one source. The very far background was in 1995, I was at the International Women's Conference in Beijing. Until then, and I was there to teach economic, I participated in economic forums, panels, teaching entrepreneurial skills to women from different countries. And at that point, I believe that economic independence was the first independence that women needed. Mm-hmm. Because I'd seen that women who were economically independent, let's say in the U.S., were able to leave a very abusive marriage. In African villages, the women who had some money used it to open schools for other girls. Mm-hmm. For me, that was the first freedom. But once I was exposed in 1995 at the International Conference in Beijing to new forces that affected women so deeply, I learned about clitoridectomy that was performed on 80 million girls and women in Africa and the Middle East. I learned about the burning of the bride of Indian women, and that's over dowry disputes among infanticide in China, which became the topic of my novel, China Doll.
Right.
I learned about judges putting molested children in the hands of their molesters to be raped for the rest of their growing years in the U.S. Mm-hmm. The novel Puppet Child came out of that. So I realized that the first freedom was a freedom from violence. I had taken that for granted. I had never been exposed. I know about domestic violence, but I've never been exposed to violence of this nature. And then this is what brings me to your question. What inspired me? There was an aging Filipina who stood on stage one day at the auditorium and was telling about her experiences when she had been a teenager. During World War II, the Japanese army captured tens of thousands of girls around the Pacific Rim and put them in what they called comfort stations for the sexual needs of the Japanese army. And now, decades later, this tiny little woman, she was maybe 75 pounds, was telling us about her experiences seeking justice. What struck me, I was wearing obviously a headset with the interpreter wording, but this tiny woman had an operatic voice. And that's my favorite music, is women's haunting voices. And the way she spoke, she was crying to high heavens with such a powerful, beautiful voice that it stayed with me, and I can still hear it. And it remained with me as I began to look into violence, use of sexual violence against women as a tool of war, as mass rape, as a tool of war, because they try to break it. They break the family, break the village, and you break a nation's spirit by breaking women this way.
Right.
And they are child brides. There's nothing but sexual violence against girls by marrying them off at puberty, and sometimes, unfortunately, before puberty. And it's happening in the United States that families that had immigrated from some countries, but there are some very particular countries, would then send their pre-teenage daughters back to Pakistan or Afghanistan before the girls can become too Americanized and rebel. So they send them as child brides to obviously mature men and not necessarily as their first wife. So child bride is another form of sexual violence. And I began to be more and more interested in the subject. And since I live in New York, I started going to the UN, to NGOs meetings, non-governmental organizations meetings, specifically those that deal with the status of women around the globe. And I started to learn about trafficking. And I thought that one day I was going to write the story of somebody like that little Japanese, not Japanese, little Filipina that I'd met that impressed me so. So that was one general background. Unrelated to that, in 2015, I was looking into just something pretty simple. Having grown up in Israel, I always knew about Tevye, the character we all are familiar with, Fiddler on the Roof. And his stories came to me as a child. They were like, I guess, volumes of that, or maybe our teaching material. But it was Tevye and his 7 daughters. It was always Tevye and his 7 daughters. So one day I said, what was the story of the other 4? So I ordered whatever the collections were that appeared, and apparently both in Hebrew and in English, the collections are called the Railroad Stories. They are structured in a way that Sholem Aleichem, the Yiddish storyteller who wrote hundreds of short stories and published them in newspapers. This was a series that he supposedly was riding on a train, and he met people and they told him his stories. So Tevye actually comes on a train and says, "Oh, Mr. Author, here you are again. Let me tell you what happened to my next daughter." And I found out that first he said, "I have 7 daughters," but then he says, "I have 6 daughters." And at the end, Sholem Aleichem only told the stories of 5 daughters, and the adaptation to Fiddler on the Roof was of only 3. And they leave the stage with 2 unmarried daughters at the end. I read the other 2 stories, and they are interesting and very well written. And the characters, of course, the characters are amazing. But in that short story collection, I came across the short story called "The Men from Buenos Aires." And that is a short story about a very sleazy character that comes from Buenos Aires, travels on a train now in Russia, meets the author, and he brags about his riches and his business acumen, and he's been so successful, but he is a chattery guy, never reveals the nature of his business. And the author keeps asking, "But what is that business you're in?" And they travel for days, and the man keeps on chattering. So finally, when the man gets off the station, and the author says, "But what's your business?" And he says, "Not Hanukkah candles," meaning not holy, sacred work.
Right.
And it leaves you, as intended. The author meant to leave the reader very queasy, uncomfortable, and suspicious, as I was, and I knew I had known something about the phenomena of trafficking of Jewish women from Eastern Europe during the late 1800s and early 1900s. And I knew that this was his business. So all I had to do was now Google it.
Okay.
I Googled it and realized that this was an unbelievable phenomena, that this was a legal union, that it was in not just Argentina, but also in Brazil and other South American countries. Prostitution was legal. the government actually collected taxes, and Argentina, 25% of the Argentine budget came from legal sex slavery of women.
Wow.
So that's when I discovered and I stumbled. So that's my second. My third one was totally unrelated. I should bring this upstairs. My mother was a very, very good artist in Israel, very successful. And she had passed away over 7 years ago, but one of my favorite paintings of hers is one of, she called the Tango Dancers. I do it after the break. I'll bring up the painting.
Okay, great.
But that painting shows a man and a woman, and they're very clearly a pimp and a prostitute. And the body language is such that she's turning away from him. And once I was starting to work on this, I did not start work on this novel. I started to work on a novel that's set in the Pacific Rim about the comfort women. But in a very convoluted way, snuck in a story about Argentina.
Okay.
Don't ask me how, but it fit.
Yeah.
And I tried to back out of that. I tried to find out ways not to bring that story, but it kept on forcing itself. And one day I was just, when I passed by my mother's paintings, I touched the corner because I know that her hands were on it.
Right.
And she remembered every brushstroke. So as I touched the corner of the painting, I said, oh my God. This is the painting that represents the story. And from that point on, this was it. I was going to go with it. And that's it. That's all my inspiration. I'm sorry that my response is so long.
That's okay. I think that's fantastic. I love how so much time passed as these elements came together from that conference in the 90s to, all of your education about women's crises around the world and sex trafficking, and then to the moment you touch the painter and the painting. And I love how this story kept working its way through your consciousness and kind of pushing the Pacific Rim story out, saying, no, this is the one. Wow. So you've got a young Russian girl, Batya, who is 14. We meet her at the opening, and her family is fleeing the pogrom. And then in comes Moskowitz, who sounds like the man on the train. He's braggadocious. He woos her parents more so than her, and convinces them that he will be the perfect husband for Batya, taking her away to Argentina to a good life. And I'm wondering how much of that aspect of the story and that Moskowitz character came from historical research, factual documents, versus this fictional story, The Man on the Train, or The Man from Buenos Aires, that you told us about. And how did fact and imagination merge as you were putting this storyline together?
I started the character by using the man from Buenos Aires. But once he became his own character, and through editing, I cannot even tell you that I recall how much remained from the original, because once he became his own person, I could see his liquid blue eyes. I don't know whether I cannot tell you if that was in the original description. I remember that I did find a discrepancy in the translations because from Yiddish was translated to Hebrew a few times, and to English I found 2 translations. The English language was so bad that's why I ended up translating, using all 5 versions to create my own version. But they were inconsistent as to describing his suit, whether it was dark blue or not. I'm not sure. but that was just a tiny part. It's the way he was speaking. He's the chattering box that he was.
Right.
And he did have the gift of gab in the third daughter eventually. But in a good way. He was charming. He was describing Buenos Aires, describing the trees,
Yes.
described the beauty of the buildings and the fountains and sculptures. So he became his own character.
Were there accounts, doing historical research like this, I know is difficult because your source people, the women in the brothels who were kidnapped and taken there, are typically from peasant families and typically illiterate. Batia can actually read, but none of her sisters in the brothel can. And so when we as authors go looking for source materials from the past, it can be difficult to find anything like a first-hand account. So what sort of sources were you able to find? Are there any stories from these women who were enslaved as prostitutes?
It's interesting because when I wrote Jerusalem Maiden, I found diaries of women who grew up in Jerusalem. I also was able, I started my interviewing for Jerusalem Maiden in 2001. My mother was alive, and other women in her generation who still remembered their mothers and their grandmothers and were able to give me like almost primary source material. In this case, there was no diary ever to be found, not by me or others. It did not exist. It's all had to be my imagination. The only somewhat of an exception was a woman by the name of Raquel Lieberman, who in 1919 got to speak to a district attorney in Buenos Aires who had for 10 years was looking for somebody to cooperate with him and bring down Tzvi Migdal, the union. The union was legal, but it was doing other illegal things.
Right.
So when she walked in to his office on Christmas night, 1919, he decided not to go home for Christmas dinner and took her testimony all night. So that testimony exists, and there have been books about her, poetry about her. I know a woman in Argentina, a writer who wrote her biography with letters and interviews of her children, because she had 2 children who grew up with some foster family out of town. And she would visit them, or she would write them letters. So she knew how to write. But also in more of this 1920, there were more of women who were somewhat literate. Not a lot, unlike the late 1800s, which were more illiterate than that. But at any rate, so we had some information from Raquel Lieberman. There had been some information that other researchers before me had looked into over the years, and they had been documented in PhD dissertations. The word PhD dissertations. They had included a variety of primary material as their sources. I do not speak Spanish, nor do I speak Yiddish. So even had those documents been available, I would not have been able to see them, to read them. Right. However, furthermore, in 1994, in Buenos Aires, there was a building called the AMIA, which stands for an acronym for all of the Jewish organizations were housed in that building, and it was bombed down to the ground. 85 people died, and about 250 were injured. With that, all the Jewish archives were destroyed. So a lot of the material that I'm referring to had been looked at by other researchers prior,
right,
in languages I could not have read anyway. But there was other material. For example, the ledger of Tzvi Migdal, the Pimps Union, their president around in 1930s left it in some private home. So that was to be found. Police records were to be found. But again, being a fiction writer, all I needed was the flavor, the information, and then just to let my imagination run loose. So most of the time when I write a new scene, I just close my eyes, I type and let it go in, and just I view the scene. I hear it, I see it, I feel it. I can tell you what the weather is like. But so that's how I write. And from that point on, it's enough just to know one item and then to see the rest of it.
I continue this conversation with author Talia Carner in next week's episode. Thank you for listening to the Storyworks Roundtable. Find all our shows, show notes, and videos at storyworkspodcast.com.